Hello and welcome back to Starmergeddon, the official TLDR news podcast. I'm Jack and I'm joined today by Georgina.
Hello.
And Ben.
Hello.
How are you both doing?
Good.
Good.
Yeah, very good.
Today's episode is obviously a relatively weighty topic, so I'm being subbed out in a minute for Zach, who will be actually hosting this episode. Well, we'll be talking about the riots that have been taking place across the UK over the last week or so. Before then, though, I just wanted to quickly update you on Too Long, our newspaper, and I'll admit this is jarring, but I just wanted to thank everyone who's already bought a copy. We are officially sold out of our August edition. The special election edition is totally sold out, and I think we were just reflecting on this as a team. I think we're all really proud and really happy with how this turned out, both from like a design and product perspective, but more importantly from a journalism perspective. I think it's sincerely some of the best work we've done, and I think all of the team are really happy with their elements and how it's all shaken out. As I say, this isn't even a sales pitch because it is sold out. You cannot buy a copy anymore. You can buy a digital copy if you want to, but the physical edition we're totally out of with no plans of restocking. So this isn't a sales pitch. We just wanted to sincerely thank everyone that's supported it, that's bought it, and that backs TLDR with all the kinds of stuff we do. So that is the message. You can, if you want, buy the December edition now if you want to pre-order it, because we might sell out again, who knows. Or you can subscribe there to make sure you get every issue and we order a copy for you every single time, so you always get a copy. That's up to you. It's over on toolong.news, and if you order now, you get a special 25% discount on every issue as long as you stay subscribed. More broadly though, thank you so much for supporting the channel, thank you for your support, and thank you for backing TLDR. With that said, let me hand over to Zach and the rest of the panel who will be doing the hard work today.
Okay, so in the main bit of the podcast, we are going to be talking, sort of unsurprisingly, we are going to be talking about the riots that are still, I think it's fair to say, engulfing the UK. We are recording this on, is it Tuesday afternoon? Yeah, it's Tuesday. Tuesday afternoon, and I think I'm reading at the moment that the police are still setting up sort of security cordons around mosques. Do one of you want to do a very quick overview for people who have been sort of living under a rock for the past couple of days of what's happened, I think probably since the Southport stabbings? Ben or Georgina?
Yeah, so the biggest instance that sort of caused this was the Southport stabbing. So this took place on the 29th of July, so last Monday. So it was a Taylor Swift themed dance class. And it was sort of 4 children between the ages of 6 and 11 that were in attendance. And a 17-year-old has been charged with murder and attempted murder. And he killed 3 of the children there and stabbed and injured a lot more people as well. Some disinformation started spreading online about the background of the 17-year-old. With some false reports suggesting that he was an asylum seeker, a refugee, and that wasn't the case. He's from Wales, born to Rwandan parents, and this misinformation started spreading quite, more widely and sort of being propagated by figures on the far right in this country, to the point where people did start rioting across a number of different cities. And then this weekend, particularly, things got very bad in a lot of different cities. There was sort of Liverpool, Hull was one of them. There's been some sort of disorder in Hull, in London as well. So this really stepped up at the weekend, and it's been continuing since then as well. And I think there's sort of been a lot of discussion at the minute about sort of the language to be used around this. The phrasing that we've used so far in this podcast and in the video the other day is riots. Obviously, there's some people using the word protest, but no, I think it's completely fair to say.
You can clear that off pretty quickly.
Yeah,
riots.
Under
basically any plausible interpretation of the word riot.
Yeah.
I'm sympathetic to semantic issues generally, but any plausible interpretation of the word
No,
riot.
exactly.
The amount of violence you've seen, especially relative to the number of people, because the number of people is actually quite small in most of these,
Yes.
but the violence per capita, as it were, is riot-worthy.
Yeah, exactly. So that's sort of the very the recent background to this was that was the trigger point. Misinformation spread online, and we've had huge riots across numerous cities in the UK since.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite a nice way into it. I mean, I think that we could spend some time sort of detailing specific events that have happened within the riots, but I think that's almost sort of redundant. I mean, the headline take here is that you've just seen some truly awful things.
Yeah.
You've had, I think, something like nearly a time of recording, nearly 100 police officers injured. Something like 500 people have now been arrested.
Yeah.
You've had, I mean, absurd amounts of sort of damage to property. You've had bricks thrown at mosques. You've had police cars burned and overturned. You even had people trying to set fire to a hotel housing asylum seekers in Rotherham, and it looked like there was no police presence there.
No.
Which is slightly astonishing.
It's worth saying in the Rotherham one that it was eventually extinguished and no one was injured in the hotel.
Yeah, good to hear. But I think that the far right thing is an interesting way in, because I think if you guys are happy to go in that direction, I think it quite naturally sort of spirals out into what I think is fundamentally more interesting, like bits of this conversation, because I think that talking about the riots, I don't think there's much to discuss really. I mean, it's just fundamentally like criminal behaviour. I don't think you can, there's not much to defend there, as it were.
No.
But I think that there are two objections that I see online to the use of the term far right. The first is the classic objection to the use of the term far right, which is that it's an unfair label that's being used by like the mainstream media to marginalize or like undermine what people see as like legitimate views. This is just like this doesn't make sense. I'm sympathetic to that argument actually in lots of other contexts. I think that, especially across Europe, people are too quick to label certain movements far right. But for people who think that this argument applies in this context, it's worth stressing like quite how extreme and nasty this politics is. I mean, this is, like in the UK, for instance, we had a whole debate over whether or not you should label reform far right. But the politics of these riots, insofar as there even is like a coherent politics, it's criminal for starters because of the violence. It's explicitly racist. I mean, that is so easy to infer from all the videos we've seen online. It's not even that there are sort of individual instances of racism, it's that those are widely endorsed by the people rioting. And the other thing is it's not like other like far right movements in like the UK, like Reform, or like in the EU. I mean, this is the politics of the rioters it's well to the right of Nigel Farage. It's sort of spearheaded by Tommy Robinson, who, just for context, is a sort of like, he is the founder of the English Defence League. And when he joined UKIP, Nigel Farage left. I mean, that gives you a sense of how far to the right this is. It's well to the right of Nigel Farage to the extent that Farage wouldn't be associated with him. And it's probably even to the right of Tommy Robinson, because Tommy Robinson's politics have actually changed quite a lot over the years. And at least in the stuff he says, I mean, he doesn't sort of go as far as let's, burn down everything. I mean, it really is like the most extreme of the extreme. If there is any instance where you could use the far right label, I mean, this has to be it. This is like an archetypal case. The other objection I see to it, which I'm actually more sympathetic to, is that it's just not even politics. Like, it's just that you can't, I mean, far right almost gives it too much credit ideologically. I mean, it's just violence. Like, it's just sort of, it's essentially football hooliganism writ large. And I think that I am sympathetic at that point. I mean, there's a really good piece by Sundar Katwala in the FT at the moment, which is about the fact that we reach for the term far right for this sort of violence because historically it was organised by groups like the EDL, who have a sort of politics to them, which you could fairly describe as far right. But the EDL is a defunct organisation these days, basically ever since Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson actually left it in 2013. This gives you a sense of how his politics has changed, because he had a slightly softening on the, he had a sort of softening on Islamophobia is almost too weak, but like, he used to be in favour of literally expelling all Muslims from Europe. And then he sort of tempered his opinions and found out that he thought the EDL was too extremist, and then he left it. Yeah, but ever since he's left, basically, that organisation has become defunct. And the riots we've seen have basically been organised via disparate groups on social media. And that it's hard to even assign a politics to it. It's just fundamentally criminal behaviour.
I have a very strong opinion on this.
Go on.
And I've seen parts of social media or parts of the media begin to discuss this as a topic. But I think what's been disappointing to me to see in the media coverage of the riots since they've happened is, and we're participating in it right now in a way, in our cushy London office, protected as members of the media and political class, where we can discuss these issues as if they are abstract concepts. We can discuss them theoretically and hypothetically. I think the point I want to make very clearly is that for millions of people of colour, including myself, but particularly brown and black people and Muslims in this country, the sense of fear that is visceral, that people feel unsafe and they feel intimidated by this criminal action and this violent extremism and fanaticism, which is racism. It is rooted in racism and Islamophobia and xenophobia, and it is a form of terror. And
so you prefer the label, because there has been some discussion about the use of the label terrorist.
There have, and I think that is justified. And I know when we use this term, people watching, people listening, possibly people here, we'll all have thoughts in our heads like, oh, but this isn't terrorism, this is just a load of far-right football hooligans. Or this isn't terrorism, this is just disaffected white men who feel, neglected by the government and they're taking to direct action and physical violence to express their grievances. But the point I want to make, and the reality of the society and culture that we are living in this country, is if we were seeing 10% of what we're seeing now, organized, coordinated attacks on institutions of faith, on institutions of British democracy and local authorities, fear being stoked on the streets and among communities, and yet the perpetrators of those attacks were ostensibly not white British-looking people, I have no doubt that the headlines we would be reading on the front pages of the newspapers would be terror on our streets, would be Islamist mob hurls bricks at church. And the fact we're not seeing those headlines reveals a lot about the biases in the media's treatment towards people of colour, immigrants, people who have immigrant backgrounds or refugee backgrounds. And that is why we are seeing this chaos and this destruction and this fear on our streets now. It's because of a decade of treatment and hypocrisy in the treatment of these different groups by the British press. And, people might say, oh, but the newspapers don't have any sway anymore. And politicians, they just say words. And these phrases like stop the boats, they're just sound bites and they don't mean anything. But when we're seeing this physical violence, brutality, and fear that people with immigrant backgrounds and ethnic minorities in this country are feeling now, at the not just subtle forms of racism that have come through newspaper reporting in the previous few years, but actual physical violence, openly expressed racism, people shouting slogans like, "You're not English anymore," "I want my country back," "Stop the boats," it's terrifying. And this culture has been allowed to proliferate by the way that we discuss topics like immigration and by the way that these are reported on by the press and in the broadcast media. And it's still happening now. And if we don't call out these hypocrisies and these inconsistencies, then all we are doing is allowing this culture to take root and spread even further. And there's a dual thing here, right? Part of it is the shifting of the window of what is considered acceptable in public discourse to a place where migrants are now so dehumanized that we can talk about them as if they are not human beings. And we can throw terms around like Islamist and Islamism and invasion and all these terms that we've heard over the past few years. The other aspect intertwined with that is the rise of social media, and particularly platforms like X, which we all know because we've all discussed in the past few days, have become these, I don't even know how to describe X anymore, this like alternative organization platform, hate platform that people, you don't even have to go looking for this stuff. You go on your For You page and scroll, and these horrible...
Well, sometimes it's Elon Musk interacting.
And Elon Musk is guilty. He is the most complicit one of the most complicit in what is happening right now. You know, his tweet the other day, I'm trying to remember it word for word, something like...
He was talking about civil war. He kept on talking about ethnic civil war.
Yeah.
And actually, if you search on his account, he's basically said multiple times since about mid-2023, he has claimed that Europe as a whole is headed for ethnic civil war based on their like migration trends, which obviously I think we all agree that's just like lunacy. I mean, it's just not the reflection of the reality. But the other thing is, I think it's probably it points to this wider issue about like social media regulation, and that I think this is probably something that everyone sort of knows about, and trying to get a handle on social media is one of the most difficult like policy issues, like as it were, of our time. But I do think that this will probably inspire some more stringent regulation from Starmer. And we had the online safety bill a while ago, which Ben knows a fair bit about. And I remember there was the legal but harmful condition that was included in the original draft of the bill, but then was quickly dropped for fears of basically sort of like government overreach.
Yeah.
I don't know what honestly, the answer here is elusive. I mean, there's clearly no simple answer, like finding a policy, devising a policy that balances out all the sort of like pros and cons and is actually effective. Because one of the other issues is obviously that if you censor something like X, it just goes onto like Telegram or one of those other more like private channels, which are harder to censor. I think it's a separate video, let alone podcast. But I do think you'd expect to see something more stringent coming from Keir Starmer in a couple of days.
But once again, whilst I agree that, of course, going forward, there will be conversations happening about regulation on social media, about allowing this sort of stuff to be out there in the open, spread around, we have to look at how this situation has been allowed to come about in the first place. And we have to challenge the assumptions and the biases that are inherent in the sorts of political discourse and societal discourse that we hear and we read in the newspapers, we see on TV, we hear on the radio, and we hear come out of politicians' mouths. Because that's what has allowed this movement to go from being something that maybe these disaffected white men used to feel in their doors, closed off on the streets within their own communities. But it's now something that's playing out on the streets and is therefore forcing people to stay home because they don't feel safe going out. And, I make these points with passion because
It's evident, yeah.
Yes, but I have experienced what it's like to feel like you don't belong in your own country. I have experienced racist abuse myself. I have experienced feeling unsafe, targeted attacks in the streets, people pulling, making gestures at me, pulling their eyes at me, whatever else. I'm not making this about me, but I'm saying that I, as one of 12% of the British journalism industry that are not white, have to use this position that I have now to say that we as an industry are also complicit. We have also played a role in stoking this division and shaping this discourse. And that figure, 88% of British journalists are white. When you look at senior editorial figures, that jumps to 94%. And if you don't have representation and you don't have ethnic minority journalists who feel that they can stand up and say, and I'm very grateful to be on this podcast to have the opportunity to make these points, to say, actually, guys, I think this headline is a bit too extreme, or I think we should think about the framing of this article, because who are we scapegoating this issue onto? Who are we blaming in the language that we're using? And what is the long-term effect of all of this going to be? If you have industries that are not diverse and you prevent people from being able to express these points and make these points calmly and clearly and respectfully, then you're going to end up in a situation where you create this echo chamber that is now no longer behind closed doors, but is, as I've said, playing out on the streets through physical violence. And I really wish, but I don't believe it will happen, that the tabloid press, that the broadcasters and right-wing politicians, particularly those previous cabinet ministers in the last Conservative government, take a long, hard look at themselves now and think, what role have I played in allowing this culture to take hold and to take root? And there's no simple solution to that, because it's been built over a period of a decade. But it's just the fact that these conversations need to be being had now, and they need to be being had respectfully and out in the open, because the more we try and take these issues and turn them into questions of, oh, but can you label these protests as far right? Or, oh, has multiculturalism failed in Britain? The more you are deflecting from your own role in creating this culture. And it's been a real shame to see, I think, some of the coverage, as I said before, of these riots and the fact that these conversations are not being had. But once again, when you look at the makeup of these industries, and it's almost, I'm not blaming anyone, but it's hard to start having those conversations if the inclusion of people who have been victims of this society are not there to make their points.
But surely you want to make a distinction, because you're talking about the journalism industry there, and it's quite a lot to unpack, but surely you want to make a distinction there between like different outlets. I mean, I don't think it's true that like the media industry as a whole has got something to answer for here. I mean, you talked later on about the tabloid press. I think you can make that argument quite persuasively.
For sure.
But I think that the UK media landscape as a whole has probably shifted left over the past couple of years. The newspapers do have less power. I mean, I think they still hold some responsibility, but I'm just wary of tarring the journalism industry as a whole.
Yeah, okay, I take that point and I agree. I think I didn't mean to tar the entire industry with one brush, but I think when you look at circulation figures from the newspapers, it's the British tabloids that are the most widely read. And again, it's easy for us, we all love publications like the FT, The Economist, who very much share TLDR's values of being impartial, of checking the facts, of checking the language that we use, and of not taking a side, or of giving context where we do and caveats where we do. But the reality is, most of what people see are the front pages of the tabloids. And most of what they hear are these sound bites that come from politicians that are, consciously or unconsciously designed to separate people and to create disunity, because in a way that is, it's where conflict stems from, but it also allows, it's the kind of divide and conquer mindset. I'm getting pretty abstract now, but it works, right? It works for politicians to separate people out into distinct groups, because they then allow themselves to pick a base and build it up from there, instead of just saying, guys, as a nation, we should all be involved in this conversation that's happening right now, and we should all listen to each other's perspectives. And I have no doubt that these young men who are rioting are angry. I have no doubt that they feel they are justified in their actions, rightly or wrongly, because of the failures of successive governments' immigration policies, or failures to address, social housing shortfalls, or failures to address and eradicate poverty in the country. I have no doubt that those things and the class system all play into this sense of fury, but it doesn't justify the violence. And if, there's
a lot going on there.
There's a lot going on.
No, I think that.
Can I just jump in on one
go
thing
on.
here? I know that you mentioned immigration and the role that the media has played in this, and I think that one of the things that I have noticed in the last few years, and I think it's probably been present for the last almost 15 at this point, which is that newspapers generally, and the media generally, will jump to discuss almost the latest thing on that in terms of legislation without, and I think this is one of the big failures in their explanation of any of this, is that they don't explain the actual system itself, how any of it works, how the asylum system works, or anything like that. So whenever you get a new piece of legislation, I'm talking specifically about the last government, you get anything on the sort of the Rwanda plan or anything like that, it'll explain that the headline thing on this is what we're doing with illegal immigrants being sent to Rwanda, but they won't, and this is the frustration, especially having written a lot of these videos, is that the actual asylum system, how the asylum claims process works, and specifically the legality around that in this country, in terms of having to be in the country in order to claim asylum, that's often not explained. So people jump to this thing of seeing a graph with immigration going up, hearing that the government wants to send illegal immigrants to Rwanda, and that's it. That's the two things that they hear, is that they see is the graph and this proposed solution by the government. But the nuances of how the actual international asylum system works, the nuances of specifically the requirement to be in the country, and that there being only, I think, 3 safe and legal routes, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and was it Hong Kong? I think it was the other one. It's only 3 safe and legal routes. All of that is often lost in the discourse, and I think that it's almost been a failure of actually explaining the issue, and that makes having the discourse even harder, because if people don't understand the background to it, discussing solutions is almost pointless if you don't understand the background to it. I think that's also been another. I know that the focus of what you were talking about was specifically the tabloids, but I think even more broadly than the tabloids, there's been a failure to actually explain the issue and the background to it over the last few years.
I think that was a fantastic point. Fantastica point. Fantastic point. Completely agree. And we discussed, I remember, for a while doing doing a video on like what Europe gets wrong about immigration or something.
I think we did talk about
sort of
doing
thing.
that.
But it's exactly that. Picking up on what Ben said about immigration is this catch-all term that is thrown around, and when you hear it, the images that you get in your mind are these dark-faced people in life jackets on an orange boat crossing the channel at night to come and, I don't know, steal your jobs or whatever. And there are so many nuances within that. And people don't understand. They don't understand the nuances of the system. They don't understand why certain forms of immigration, labour force are useful, while other kinds of immigration, where there are unjustified claims of asylum and whatever else, are possibly the actual problem. But people just don't think about these things, because it's far easier for immigration to become this button-pressing kind of topic that is weaponized and traded between politicians and thrown around in the media to get people's attention. And there is a complete lack of understanding of all of the nuances surrounding that, which is also, as Ben says, it's existing, and it's disappointing as well. And there's no easy fix to that as well, unless, I don't know, everyone signs up to do some like lectures on the immigration system.
So the only thing, I think I agree with some of this, but I'm hesitant on a couple of points. I mean, one of the main points I'm hesitant on is that I'm wary that we're almost like giving rioters too much credit, and sort of assigning a politics to them that I don't think even really exists. I mean, like, to my mind, it's just basically racist criminality. I think talking in too much detail about their takes on like asylum policy or stuff like that. I mean, I'm not disputing that probably some of the inflammatory language that especially like the tabloid press uses might be a contributing factor, but my basic point there is that I think it's just like.
I think it's.
Do you see what I'm getting at there?
I understand what you're getting at, and I think that for some people in this, it's violent thuggery and maybe jumping on what's already happened. But the sort of these riots haven't just come from nowhere. There's something has stirred people up. Something has got people angry in the first place. So that anger doesn't just happen. Something causes that. Something stirs that up. And I think it's fair to say, and the way that far-right politicians have jumped on this and have sort of mobilised supporters to start this, I'm not saying that every protester subscribes to a particular ideology or anything like that, but riots don't just happen out of, like, especially on this scale in this number of cities, something causes them. And I'm saying that the people that started this, the people that have caused these, have been whipped up and have felt a sense of, I guess, betrayal on immigration and asylum, things like that, for years. And that, again, doesn't happen in a vacuum. That doesn't happen from nowhere. Again, when you see people looting Shoe Zone in Hull, I doubt those people have an ideology. I doubt they're going into that thinking, when they're holding 5 pairs of Crocs in their hands, thinking I'm really sticking it to the politicians that haven't delivered immigration policy.
Point very nicely. That's
However,
yeah.
I don't think that everybody that had taken part in the riots went into it originally wanting to get 5 pairs of Crocs. I think that some people did go into it having read for years that they're being overrun with immigrants and that asylum seekers are taking their jobs and that politicians keep promising to reduce immigration to the tens of thousands and fail to.
But I think we also agree that it's not that every policy area that's adjacent to these riots is just tarnished and legitimate. The issue is that the media's coverage or at least this is at least parts of the media's coverage, has been lacking in context or nuance, which I think is hard to deny. And that definitely plays a causal role. I think we basically actually agree on most of these things. So I agree that spending too much time defining the riots and putting them on a political spectrum is fundamentally redundant. As the point I was trying to make at the beginning. I also agree that the right-wing press has failed in many respects. I mean, this is the thing that Ben was talking about before, in like providing context or like provide like a healthy debate. I think that's just like trivially true, isn't it? And I think we can also agree that it's played a causal role in the stuff that we've seen over the last couple of days. I'm not saying I agree with these things, but I think that it's worth examining what they say are the causal roles, or what like the Tommy Robinson of this world say are the sort of like background causes to this. So I think in a way they would agree with us stuff. They would say similar stuff about immigration, or they're probably just parroting sort of media points. But one of the proximate triggers, something we talk about in the video, is this notion of two-tier policing. And this comes off the back of a series of other sort of like bits of civil unrest that happened earlier in the month, that were seized upon by the sort of Tommy Robinson types as proof that the police have like lost control in some sense, or or that they treat different groups differently. What I think is, I don't really want to get into the dangerous territory of evaluating that claim, but what I do think is interesting about that is you hear that from both sides of the aisle. We talked about this a while ago, but this is something that actually the left has been pretty furious about for a while, in the context of both. I mean, the Sarah Everard vigil was a very direct example, because
yes, it really was.
Those people who remember that was after Wayne Couzens, who was a police officer, was convicted of murdering. Was it? I mean, what was the relationship? It was just a woman
and raping a woman.
Yeah,
in a car.
She was walking back home, and I think she was like, there was some. It was in COVID, and there's some things around that.
Was the vigil in COVID as well? No.
The vigil was in COVID.
That's why they cracked down on it. Yeah.
But this was the reason that people criticised this, outside of even just the horrific nature of how the police responded, was that at the same time there were anti-vax protests taking place, and the police took a widespread sort of hands-off approach to anti-vax protests, but took a very hands-on, quite aggressive role to the Sarah Everard vigil.
And then also the other example that shows that this is a sort of bipartisan issue is that with the protests, the pro-Palestine protests that we've seen like across the UK over the last couple of months, the right wingers, the Tommy Robinson types, were claiming that they were being mistreated because their sort of counter protests were cracked down upon more aggressively. But then also the net zero protesters, Just Stop Oil protesters, were complaining that we get put in jail for 4 years for disrupting a road, but you can have massive sort of unscheduled demonstrations down Oxford Street. Do you think there's anything to this, and how do you think the police should respond to it? Because it's clearly a touchy issue. We also saw that the head of police grabbed a journalist's microphone when he was asked about it just a couple of days ago, which is pretty astonishing. So clearly it's something that they're slightly anxious about.
I can't talk too much on the two-tier policing. I think that requires quite a lot of evaluation of exactly how the police respond to quite a widespread sort of amount of protest and civil unrest and things like that. And as you say, there were instances where the left have been frustrated, and clearly the right has been making this argument as well. But I think it's worth saying that in terms of going forward with this, I think there's discussion from the Labour government at the minute about introducing new mechanisms to make sure that those that have taken part in the rioting recently, see justice served very quickly. So Starmer was the director of public prosecutions back in 2011, and there were sort of huge riots in London and in other cities in the UK, and he introduced 24-hour courts so that people would go through the judicial system very quickly. And the theory was at the time, that if people see that justice is being served very quickly to people who are even involved on the periphery in the riot,
and quite
will
stringently so as well.
Yes, and I think he made a point of turning up to like a court at like 4 a.m. that was taking place to sort of like show his face and show his support for that. So there was that element, and then there was just a lot of police presence. There was like a two-pronged approach to the riots. Was very, very quick justice being served very quickly and a huge amount of police presence in the aftermath. And I think he's already announced that he's going to sort of introduce these 24-hour courts, that is something that's being looked at, or it's either being looked at or it's been introduced, I can't remember exactly what. And obviously police presence has been increased. I mean, I was in Hull at the weekend and I was getting the train, and there were just huge amounts of police, as you can imagine, around the train station. So I think that's the way that Starmer's sort of like looking at this at the minute. But as you say, I know the question is specifically about two-tier policing. Unless you look at all these things, it's quite difficult
it's
to
hard
say
to
exactly.
evaluate. Georgina, any thoughts on how the government should respond
to the riots?
Yeah,
it's a very
both like legally and politically.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I have thought about it. I think politically, it's like almost impossible, because whatever the government says is going to end up either stoking further resentment towards the government and police from within those groups that are rioting currently. Perhaps if they are, if they're labelled far-right thugs and they don't identify with that label, then they'll get angrier. On the other hand, if the government is seen to be too soft, then a whole proportion of people in this country are going to still continue to feel unsafe. I know that this morning, I think Starmer announced 567 new prison places had been freed up for...
which is, it interacts in quite difficult ways with the prisons crisis.
It really does. And that in itself is, again, like a very short-term but also kind of worrying punitive measure, because these people are going to, we assume, be locked up with just themselves, their own thoughts, their own resentment towards particular groups and the government and the police and the people who've put them in prison. And they're going to come out and feel even more justified in their pursuit of chaos, destruction and fear-mongering, which is what we've seen with Tommy Robinson, who is a convicted criminal.
He's been in 4 times.
He's been in 4 times, and each time he comes out and he's stronger, and his base gets bigger and bigger, and the EDL is now out on our streets, throwing bricks and hurting people and making gestures and all the rest of it.
Tommy Robinson he's in Cyprus.
Well, he's on a sunbed in Cyprus, apparently.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a deeply
There's
disturbing.
just not really a good answer, is there? I mean, if that's your take on
that's my
the
take.
failures of like the rehabilitative element of the prison system, then there isn't really a good answer, I guess.
No.
I mean, the optimistic take is that maybe prison sentence will do what it's supposed to do and sort of teach people that they did the wrong thing, and then maybe they'll come out reformed. But no, not convinced.
Not convinced.
I think on the long term, obviously it is a very tricky question. But in terms of the short term, putting an end to the immediate riots.
I agree, yeah.
The experience from 2011 has been sort of praised across the board in terms of that two-prong approach.
I agree.
That
and it did work very suddenly.
For the sake of the millions of people who are terrified at what's happening, you've got to lock these people up. Just put them away, get them off the streets. And then, just, I guess, hope that in that time the government has had time to regroup and think about how to actually prevent this happening again.
I think, I agree. I actually think it is difficult, the long term. I mean, long term, it raises a whole load of really difficult questions for the government. I think especially about social media regulation. I know we've talked a lot about the mainstream media and the tabloid media, but I do think that actually the more acute issue there is social media.
Yeah,
the tabloid media is declining. Yeah. Social media and the Elon Musk lot, and I mean, that's on the up, as it were. And I do think that that's the main conduit.
We've already seen intense policy debates around the online safety bill and some specific stipulations there, but they're sort of, in a lot of ways, were designed as the sort of starting place for further regulation
and
online.
Now we've really got to speed things
sort
up.
Of dropped quite a lot of the hard elements to that. And again, I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with certain elements of the online safety bill, but as I say, the sort of basis of that was meant to be like a starting point, a first step towards online regulation. The fact that we found that even too tricky, really, in terms of legislation,
and it becomes immediately difficult the second you sort of think about it for 2 seconds. Of course, it's just not just questions of sort of like how you balance all the competing moral principles about freedom of speech and like sort of utility or disutility of letting people be lunatics on social media, but then also just like whether or not it actually works. Keep going back to this, is that like people calling for stricter regulation, but a lot of this has already been organised by like Telegram and stuff like that. And if you push people off Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or whatever, onto the public ones, you just push them onto like weirder bits of the internet, and they end up
like X is now.
Yeah, X has become a bit of a,
Yeah.
this is a separate conversation, I think, but there's such a good point. I mean, it is kind of wild, the vibe shift on X and how much the algorithm has, I mean, at least in my experience, has shifted right. The short term, relatively easy, just lock them up. But I think it becomes more difficult in the short term if there are significant counter protests, because, I mean, then you get into the whole difficult issue of like, how do you like appear to police, how do you appear to like maintain or uphold the rule of law? You know, like how do you apply the law consistently there? And I think it remains to be seen. I think so far it looks like it might be successful doing the sort of 2011 approach. Things might calm down, and that would be the best option for the government. But basically, if things don't calm down, then for a whole load of reasons, including the sense that you have to be seen to be policing consistently, and the prisons crisis, the fact we just don't have that many spaces, then things become a lot more difficult in the short term.
Seems like a good place to wrap it up.
Yeah, cheery stuff. Thank you very much for watching this cheery, fun, happy, frothy podcast on a Tuesday afternoon. Please do join us for the next podcast. We promise it'll be light. Well, it might not be. We might still be in the summer of discontent, in which case we'll be fighting off the Tommy Robinson hordes outside our window, and hopefully we'll get it to you. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you again next week.